"You're getting the dog, that's it," my son said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. Laughter followed. Even the lawyer didn't meet my eyes. But Richard left more than a pet behind. He left a trail. A plan. By sunrise, the trucks were rolling, and the safes were open. What they thought was mine? Tripled. What I claimed? Untouchable. They gave me the dog. I took the legacy. Wait. Before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The air inside Holloway and Associates felt different that morning, heavier, like the wood-paneled walls had absorbed every argument, every secret ever spoken in this building. My heels clicked against the marble as I crossed the lobby, each step echoing far louder than it should. I dressed carefully. Black dress, pearl earrings Richard had once bought me in Charleston. Not for them, but because I refused to let anyone think I'd come here looking small. Mark was already in the hallway outside the conference room. My steps slowed without meaning to. He saw me, straightened, and extended his hand as though we were strangers meeting at a bank. The handshake was cold, formal. His smile never reached his eyes. "Claire," he said, voice neutral. "Mark." I nodded once. We'd been in the same room fewer than a dozen times in our lives, and each one had been equally pleasant, which is to say, not at all. Mr. Holloway appeared in the doorway, glasses low on his nose. "Let's get started," he said gently, the kind of tone lawyers use when they know things are about to get uncomfortable. The conference room smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. The mahogany table stretched far longer than necessary, with high-backed chairs that swallowed whoever sat in them. Mark took the seat nearest the head. His wife, Lila, slid in beside him, her perfume sharp and sweet, like overripe fruit. I chose a spot across from them, setting my bag on the floor and my folder on the table, the one holding Richard's old letters. My fingers tapped against the cover without my permission. I wasn't sure if I'd need them, or if they were just a lifeline I couldn't bear to let go of. Mr. Holloway took his place at the head, shuffling papers. The quiet in the room wasn't polite. It was loaded. Lila leaned toward Mark, murmuring something that made the corner of his mouth twitch upward. The smirk was small, almost imperceptible, but it stung. I glanced around. No siblings, no friends, no one here to remind me Richard had loved me too. The only loyal presence was waiting outside in my car. Cooper, our golden retriever, probably sitting upright in the passenger seat, watching the front doors like he knew this was where the battle would be. Mr. Holloway cleared his throat, drawing every eye to him. "This is the last will and testament of Richard Allen Bennett," he began, voice slow and deliberate. His gaze flicked. To me briefly, then back to the paper. The sentences came like stones tossed into a still pond, each one sending out ripples that would eventually reach and crash over me. There was no warmth in the reading, just clauses, percentages, property descriptions. My nails dug lightly into the leather folder. Mark sat with his chin lifted, as if the outcome was already a foregone conclusion. Lila kept her expression fixed somewhere between pity and amusement. Mr. Holloway's voice droned on, but I caught only fragments. Shares of Bennett Holdings, primary residence, designated heir. My throat felt tight. The pen in front of me rolled slightly with the grain of the table. I caught it and set it back down, just to have something to do with my hands. When Holloway paused to turn a page, the silence was deafening. I could hear the faint hum of the heating vent, the ticking of the brass clock on the far wall, and my own pulse in my ears. I knew then that whatever came next was going to set the tone for everything that followed. The will reading had only just begun, but I could already feel the first fractures forming in the air between us, sharp, invisible lines that would soon split this family in two. Mr. Holloway adjusted his glasses, eyes scanning the next page as though weighing whether to soften the blow. He didn't. "The primary residence at 14 Sycamore Lane," he read, "is to be transferred in full to Mark Bennett." The words landed like cold metal. "The controlling shares of Bennett Holdings, along with all associated dividends." His voice didn't waver. "To Mark Bennett." He kept going, line after line. "The savings account, the lake cabin in Vermont, the investment portfolio." Each sentence was a chisel to stone, carving my name out of a life I had built with Richard. Finally, he reached me. "To Claire Bennett." a monthly allowance of $1,500, adjusted annually for inflation, and ownership of Cooper. For a moment, the air seemed to thicken, as if the oxygen had been replaced with something heavier. Mark leaned forward across the table. His cologne, something sharp and musky, reached me before his words did. "You're getting the dog. That's it," he said, the edges of his mouth curving into a smile that was all teeth. A muffled laugh escaped from Lila. Someone else on their side of the table chuckled under their breath, then quickly coughed it away. I made no sound. My pulse was a steady drumbeat in my ears, but my face stayed still. I fixed my gaze on a knot in the wood of the table, letting the lawyer's voice fade into background static. For a second, the room dissolved, replaced by another image. Richard sitting in his armchair last winter, his face pale under the lamplight. He'd been reading the paper, avoiding my eyes. I had asked him again about updating the will. "We'll talk about it when I'm feeling better," he'd said, folding the page with deliberate care. The fire had popped and hissed in the grate. Cooper had lifted his head from Richard's feet as if sensing the tension, but the conversation never happened. Every time I'd brought it up, he'd found a way to sidestep it, to change the subject to something safer. A neighbor's new car, a movie he wanted to watch. I told myself it wasn't avoidance, that he simply didn't want to dwell on dying. The flashback faded, replaced by the weight of the moment in front of me. Mr. Holloway closed the folder in front of him with a soft but final click. "That concludes the reading of the will." Chairs scraped back. Mark and Lila stood immediately, their voices low but tinged with satisfaction. I gathered my things slowly, giving my hands something to do. My fingers brushed the folder of letters, still unopened. No one looked directly at me as I left the room. The carpeted hallway muted my footsteps, but I could still hear Mark laughing with someone behind me. Outside, the winter air hit like a slap, cold and clean after the stale heaviness of the conference room. Cooper was waiting where I'd left him, sitting straight in the passenger seat, ears pricked forward the instant he spotted me. His tail thumped against the door. I slid into the driver's seat and wrapped my hand around his leash before I'd even turned the ignition. The leather felt warm from the sun, familiar in a way nothing else did anymore. I held it tighter than I meant to, as though it were the only thing tethering me to this life. Cooper leaned his head onto my lap, sighing in that deep, contented way dogs do when they trust you completely. My throat ached. I started the engine without looking back at the building. The marble floors, the smirks, the laughter. They could stay there, locked behind those polished doors. I drove away in silence, the weight of what had just happened pressing into the space between each breath. By the time I pulled into the driveway, dusk had settled over the street, turning the bare trees into dark lace against a bruised sky. The house felt different without Richard. It had for months, but tonight the emptiness seemed to hum in the walls. I hung my coat by the door and went straight to the kitchen. The kettle rattled faintly as I filled it, the metal ringing in the quiet. I spooned loose tea into the pot while Cooper patted in, nails clicking softly on the tile. The fireplace in the living room still bore the marks of our last winter together. A faint scorch on the brick from when he'd overloaded the fire, the worn leather armchair angled just so toward the hearth. I set the tea down on the coffee table, lowering myself into the sofa. Cooper jumped up beside me without waiting for permission, his weight a familiar grounding pressure against my thigh. He rested his head in my lap, warm and steady. I stroked his fur absent-mindedly, my mind replaying the afternoon. The glint in Mark's eyes when Holloway read my inheritance. The way Lila had looked at me like I was a guest at the wrong table. Every detail was sharp. The smell of lemon polish in the room, the way Mark's voice had sliced through the air with, "You're getting the dog. That's it." Each memory lit a slow, steady burn in my chest. I leaned back, staring into the dark grate where ashes still clung in the corners. Richard had sat there, night after night, reading the paper or watching me knit, making small talk about the news. He'd had his faults, but he had never been cruel. And yet, the will was exactly that. Unless, the thought surfaced like something breaking through ice. I set my tea aside, rose, and climbed the stairs to the attic. The pull cord for the light was cold in my hand. The bulb flickered before it steadied, casting a yellow glow over stacks of boxes and old furniture. I knew what I was looking for before I saw it. The battered cedar chest tucked in the far corner, the one Richard had once told me was Just old business files. Dust coated the lid in a thick layer. I coughed, brushing it away before lifting it open. Inside were neat stacks of envelopes, some brittle with age, others more recent. Beneath them, I found a manila folder with my name written in Richard's handwriting. My breath caught. I slid it open, and there, tucked among bank statements and correspondence, was a single handwritten note on Richard's stationery. Claire, it began, the ink slightly smudged as though he'd written it in haste. If you're reading this, it means things have not gone as we discussed. There are papers you'll know how to use. Trust your instincts. Don't let anyone take what's yours. The words blurred for a moment before I blinked them clear. My thumb traced the loop of his signature. I could hear his voice in those lines, low and certain. Memories pressed in. Richard at the kitchen table one rainy night, swirling the last of his coffee, murmuring about plans that will make sure you're taken care of. I'd asked what he meant. He'd only smiled and said, "Some things are better left as surprises until they're needed." The attic seemed smaller now, the air thicker. I knelt there, staring at the note until Cooper whined softly from the stairs. I folded the paper carefully, sliding it back into the folder. When I stood, my legs felt steadier than they had all day. I didn't know yet what Richard had meant, or where those papers were. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I wasn't walking away from this with just the dog. Not by a long shot. The kitchen table disappeared beneath stacks of paper. I'd emptied the cedar chest and spread everything out. Bank statements with numbers that made my stomach tighten, property deeds stamped in fading ink, letters Richard had written but never mailed. The scent of old paper mingled with the faint tang of the lemon cleaner I'd used that morning. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches against the window. Cooper lay nearby, tail thumping lazily now and then, his head tilted as if he knew I was digging for something important. I worked slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the cramped handwriting and typed lines. Most of it was familiar. Our house on Sycamore, the lake cabin, a few accounts I'd seen before. But then, tucked between two unrelated statements, I found it. A deed for a property in upstate New York. I frowned. The address meant nothing to me. The deed was dated just 2 years ago, and instead of Richard's name, it listed Bennett Family Trust as the owner. My gaze caught on a small notation at the bottom. Activation requires signatures of both trustees, Claire Bennett and Mark Bennett. My pulse ticked faster. Why would Richard buy a property I'd never heard about, then set it up so Mark and I both had to sign for it? And why wasn't it mentioned in the will? I picked up my phone before I could talk myself out of it and scrolled to a name I hadn't used in a while. David Kent. He and Richard had worked together in the early days of Bennett Holdings, and while I'd always liked him, I'd learned he was the kind of man you called only when you really needed him. He answered on the second ring. "Claire? Been a while." His voice was warm but cautious. "I need to ask you something," I said, lowering my voice though I was alone. "Do you know anything about a property Richard bought in upstate New York? Under the family trust?" There was a pause, long enough that I thought the line might have gone dead. "I know a little," David said finally, "and I know it wasn't listed in any corporate filings." "Why not?" Another pause, shorter this time. "Because what's on that property isn't the kind of thing you list if you want the IRS or certain people to know about it." I straightened in my chair. "Certain people like Mark?" David gave a short laugh without humor. "Let's just say your stepson wouldn't be too happy if you got your hands on it first." I glanced at the deed again, my finger tracing the neat legal lines. "What is it, David?" "I can't tell you exactly over the phone, but I can tell you this. Richard once said it was his insurance policy. For you." The words settled over me, heavy but electric. Insurance policy. For me. I thanked him and ended the call, my tea now cold on the table beside me. My eyes roamed over the papers again, back to the joint signature requirement. If Mark learned about this before I acted, it would be over. But if I could get there first. The plan began to take shape before I'd even realized I was making one. I'd need to see the place without him knowing. I'd need someone I could trust to help me move quietly, maybe even someone in real estate who could dig deeper without leaving a trail. I stacked the documents neatly, tucking the deed and trust paperwork into the folder with Richard's note. Cooper lifted his head as I slid my chair back, his eyes following me as I carried everything to my desk and locked it away. The key felt warm in my hand. I wasn't sure yet exactly what I would find in upstate New York, But I knew one thing: whatever was waiting there could change everything, and Mark would be the last person to see it coming. The next morning, the cafe was half empty, sunlight filtering through the tall front windows in muted gold. I spotted David in a corner booth, his jacket draped over the seat beside him, a newspaper folded neatly on the table. He rose when I approached, his smile faint but genuine. "Claire." He gestured for me to sit. "I ordered us coffee. Thought you could use something stronger than tea." The aroma was rich, dark, almost too warm for the knot in my stomach. I wrapped my hands around the mug anyway. "You said yesterday there was something you couldn't tell me over the phone," I prompted. David glanced toward the counter, then leaned in. "There's more to Richard's will than what Holloway read in that room." I felt my spine stiffen. More? Richard had me present when he dictated a second document, a personal letter of instruction, sealed. He didn't want Mark to know about it unless certain circumstances were met. My mind flashed to Mark's smirk, his words: "You're getting the dog, that's it." The memory made my jaw tighten. What kind of circumstances? David's eyes met mine, steady. "If Mark disrespected you during the will reading, you'd be entitled to claim any sentimental assets you saw fit. No questions asked." Richard was adamant about it. The cafe's hum seemed to fade. I pictured Richard sitting across from me at our old kitchen table, the way he sometimes spoke in layered sentences, what he said and what he didn't. "He knew Mark would take the bait," I murmured. David nodded. Richard wasn't blind to his son's character. "That comment yesterday? You could walk into the house tomorrow and take anything of emotional value, and it would be yours, legally. Holloway has the sealed document." I sat back, the coffee cooling between my palms. The weight of it settled in slowly, like a tide rising on my feet. "Mark doesn't know." "No," David said. "And if I were you, I'd keep it that way. Once he catches wind, he'll fight it. Hard." Outside, a bus hissed to a stop, its brakes squealing. Inside, I could hear the faint clink of dishes, the low murmur of other conversation. But in my head, the pieces were rearranging themselves. The will, the property in New York, and now this. An open door Richard had built just for me. I leaned forward. "How airtight is it?" "Airtight enough that Holloway can't ignore it. It's signed, sealed, and dated. Richard made sure it would hold up in court." David sipped his coffee. "The only catch is, it's only valid if you act before the estate's personal items are officially inventoried. Once that's done, everything gets locked into the division Mark thinks he controls." The clock over the counter ticked audibly now. Every second felt sharper. "How long do I have?" "Days," David said. "Maybe less." I nodded slowly, the decision already forming. "Then I move tonight." David studied me for a moment, then gave a small smile. Richard would have liked that answer. By the time I left the cafe, the cold had crept in under a thin veil of cloud. I walked to my car with my scarf pulled tight, feeling the wind tug at the ends. Cooper greeted me with an eager tail wag from the back seat, his breath fogging the window. As I drove home, my mind was quiet, not from lack of thought, but from focus. I would go to Holloway's office under a pretext, get eyes on that sealed envelope, and start my list. Sentimental assets. Richard's study alone held enough to cripple Mark's victory parade. Back at the house, I set the documents from yesterday in a neat stack, locking them in my desk drawer. Then I made calls, quiet ones, to people who knew how to work without asking too many questions. By nightfall, the plan was sketched out in full. Tomorrow, I'd be in Holloway's office. By the end of the week, Mark would understand something I already knew. I was no one's afterthought. And Richard, wherever he was, had made sure of it. The next morning, I pulled into the parking lot of Holloway and Associates with Cooper riding shotgun. His ears twitched as I cut the engine. "This'll be quick," I told him, though the truth was I had no idea how long it would take. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of eucalyptus from the potted plants lined against the wall. The receptionist looked up, her smile polite but distant. "Mrs. Bennett, do you have an appointment?" "I don't," I said, lowering my voice to something casual. "Just thought I'd pop in to clear up the pet ownership paperwork from the will. I'd hate for there to be any confusion about Cooper." She hesitated, then picked up the phone. "Let me see if Mr. Holloway is available." Minutes later, I was ushered into his office. The room was dimmer than the conference room, lined with law books that smelled faintly of dust and leather. Holloway stood behind his desk, his posture as precise as the man himself. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "What can I do for you?" I slid into the seat, placing my bag on my lap. It's about Cooper. I just wanted to double-check the paperwork to make sure there aren't any future disputes. I let the sentence trail off, as though the thought had just occurred to me. While I'm here, I also wondered if Richard left any secondary document. You know, personal letters, instructions, things that might have sentimental value. Holloway's pen paused mid-spin between his fingers. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the heating vent. Secondary documents? He repeated, like he was weighing each syllable. Yes, I said lightly, leaning back. He was always a man who planned ahead. I just want to be thorough. Another long pause. Then he rose, crossing to a locked cabinet behind his desk. He unlocked it with a key from his pocket, rifled through several folders, and finally drew out a large cream-colored envelope sealed with red wax. My heart kicked hard against my ribs. He set it on the desk between us. I shouldn't. He stopped, glanced toward the closed door, then pushed it forward. You didn't get this from me. I nodded once, sliding the envelope closer. Without breaking the seal, I eased it open just enough to see the first page. Richard's handwriting flowed across the top, bold and unmistakable. I pulled my phone from my bag, angling it discreetly. The shutter sound was silenced. Each click was invisible, but my hands were steady as stone. Once I had every page photographed, I slipped the document back exactly as I'd found it. Thank you, I said quietly. Holloway only gave a short nod, as though acknowledging something unspoken. By the time I got home, the sky was already fading to steel gray. I sat at the dining table with the photos pulled up on my laptop. The clause was crystal clear. Any asset I deemed sentimental could be claimed outright. No limitations, no appraisals necessary. I began my list. Richard's vintage car collection. 3 gleaming machines from the 50s and 60s he'd restored himself. The antique jewelry he'd inherited from his grandmother. The rare art collection in the study. Pieces he'd bought over decades. Each one chosen with care. Even the leather armchair by the fireplace could, though I doubted Mark would fight me over that. The list grew longer as I flipped through the mental inventory of the estate. Each item wasn't just valuable. It was a piece of Richard, a thread in the fabric of our life together. And each one was about to be mine. For the first time since the will reading, the heaviness in my chest eased. This wasn't desperation anymore, it was strategy. From the living room, Cooper let out a sharp bark, then another, his tail wagging like a metronome when I walked in. You feel it too, don't you? I said, scratching behind his ears. Because something had shifted. The tide wasn't just turning, it was starting to roar. I dialed Mark's number just after 9 the next morning. The sky outside was a muted silver, and Cooper was sprawled at my feet, snoring softly. I kept my tone light when he answered. Mark, it's Claire. I thought we might have a cordial discussion about dividing some of Richard's personal items. No lawyers, no drama. On the other end, I heard his low chuckle, followed by the scrape of what sounded like a chair on tile. Personal items? You mean the dog toys and maybe a few kitchen gadgets? Sure, we can do that. I smiled into the phone though he couldn't see it. Something like that. I'll bring a list. How's the day after tomorrow? The estate? Around 10? That works, he said, still amused. Don't strain yourself carrying too much. I'll manage, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. When the line clicked off, I let the smile drop. He thought he'd already won, and that was exactly the advantage I needed. 2 hours later, I was walking up the narrow stairs of a brick building downtown, the scent of turpentine and varnish growing stronger with each step. The door to Elliott Fine Art Appraisals creaked as I pushed it open. Elliott himself emerged from a back room, a man in his 60s with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that flicked immediately to the folder in my hands. Mrs. Bennett, you said you had photographs for me to review? I laid them out on his work table. Crisp images of the paintings, sculptures, and rare prints from Richard's study. He moved slowly from one to the next, muttering under his breath as his fingers hovered just above the glossy paper. He tapped a photo of a mid-century oil painting. This alone could fetch 6 figures at auction. And here, he pointed to a bronze sculpture I'd dusted just last week. Limited edition, early 20th century, museum-worthy. If your late husband had the right provenance paperwork, which I assume he did. He did, I confirmed, my voice steady though my heart was speeding up. Then you're looking at several $1 million in total, possibly more depending on market conditions. I nodded, sliding the photos back into the folder. I appreciate your discretion, Mr. Elliot. Always, he said, giving a small, knowing smile. The appraisal papers were in my hands before I left, neatly signed and dated. By the time I returned home, the late afternoon light had shifted to gold, pouring across the hardwood floors. I carried the documents straight to my study, unlocked the desk drawer, and placed them in the back beneath the trust deed and Richard's note. The key turned with a satisfying click. Leaning against the desk, I let out a slow breath. This wasn't just about reclaiming what was mine anymore. With the right moves, this could secure my future, comfortably, indefinitely. The allowance Richard left me would barely cover groceries in a few years, but these pieces, they could buy me time, freedom, and the ability to choose exactly how I wanted to live the rest of my life. Cooper padded into the room, stretching before curling into his bed by the window. Outside, the first few snowflakes of the season drifted down, catching the last of the light. I watched them fall, the edges of my plan sharpening in my mind. 2 days from now, Mark would be standing in that estate thinking I was there for scraps. I'd let him believe it, right up until the moment I walked out with treasures he wouldn't even realize were gone until it was too late. And when that moment came, I wouldn't just be taking things. I'd be taking back every inch of ground he thought he'd claimed. By Thursday morning, the pieces were ready to move. I stood at the kitchen counter, the phone wedged between my shoulder and ear as I confirmed the booking with the moving service. Yes, that's right, I said lightly. It's a donation pickup. Several large pieces, some furniture, a few art items, all for charity. The man on the other end promised a discreet crew and an early arrival. I made sure of it. When I ended the call, I reached for the printed inventory I'd been building all week. Each item labeled with its sentimental justification and its real market value noted in a separate column. The vintage cars, Richard's weekend hobby, irreplaceable memories, the antique jewelry, family heirlooms Richard insisted I keep, the rare art, our travels together, each piece a chapter. I could almost hear Richard's chuckle in my head. You've always known how to play the game, Claire. The next calls were to two people I trusted absolutely, Elaine and Thomas. They had known me and Richard for over 20 years, and both had an instinct for keeping their mouths shut. I just need you there, I told them. Think of it as being witnesses, nothing more. Elaine's voice was calm, steady. If it's for you, I'll be there. Thomas simply said, send me the address and time. By mid-afternoon, I was at my desk drafting the legal forms Holloway's office had quietly forwarded after my last visit. Each one documented an item claimed under the hidden clause, complete with my signature and space for the witnesses. I filled them in with careful penmanship, my hand steady even as my mind raced ahead to Saturday. The phone rang just as I was sealing the last envelope. Mark's name lit up the screen. Claire, he said, his voice carrying that same smug warmth from our last call. Still on for the division tomorrow? Oh, absolutely, I replied, making sure there was a smile in my... I'm keeping it light. Just a few personal pieces. You won't even notice they're gone. Perfect, he said, a faint clink of glass in the background. I'm out with friends right now, celebrating finally putting all this estate business behind us. I pictured him in some overpriced bar, leaning back with a drink in hand, confident in his victory. Enjoy yourself, I said. See you in the morning. When I hung up, the house felt almost too quiet. Outside, the late autumn wind scraped through the bare branches, rattling the shutters just enough to sound like a whisper against the glass. I moved through the rooms one last time before the day ended, taking in each object on my list. My fingers grazed the smooth hood of Richard's favorite convertible in the garage, the scent of motor oil and leather still lingering. Upstairs, I paused in front of the display case in the study, the soft glow from the desk lamp catching the bronze curves of the sculpture Elliot had nearly gasped over. Everything was ready. That night, over a simple dinner, Elaine and Thomas stopped by to review the forms. We didn't speak about strategy in detail, just nodded over the paperwork, their pens scratching as they signed. Mark's not going to see this coming, Elaine murmured, a small smile flickering at the corner of her mouth. He won't have time to, I replied. When they left, I stood at the doorway a moment longer, watching the taillights vanish down the street. Cooper sat beside me, his head tilted toward the wind as if he could smell the change coming. Tomorrow, Mark would still think this was just about a few mementos, but by the time the movers were done, he'd be standing in the echo of what he used to own, realizing too late that the storm had been building right under his nose, and I was the one bringing it. The sky was still gray when I pulled up to the long, winding drive of the Bennett estate. Frost clung to the grass, glinting faintly in the first light. I'd come early, an hour before the movers were scheduled, thinking I'd have time to walk through the house and mark each item. But as I turned the final bend, my tires crunched to a stop. The wrought iron gates were shut. A heavy chain looped through the bars. Two uniformed security guards stood just inside, their breath clouding in the cold. One of them stepped forward, his gloved hand raised. "Estate's closed, ma'am. Orders from Mr. Bennett." My fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Of course. Mark emerged from the side path a moment later, hands in the pockets of a tailored coat, looking like he'd stepped out of a glossy magazine ad for smug entitlement. "Good morning, Claire," he called, voice smooth. "Didn't expect to see you quite this early." "Open the gate," I said, keeping my tone even. He shook his head, strolling up until the bars were between us. "I spoke to a lawyer last night. A real one, not the sentimental type. He confirmed you've got no rights beyond what's in the will. So this little trip of yours, it's over before it starts." I studied him for a moment, the frost catching in his hair, his confidence practically radiating through the metal. Then I reached into my bag, pulling out a crisp folded document. "This," I said, sliding it through the narrow gap in the gate, "is the clause Richard added to his will. Signed by him, sealed by Mr. Holloway. You might want to read it before you make any more assumptions." Mark's brow furrowed as he unfolded the page. The silence stretched while his eyes scanned the lines. Behind him, one of the guards cleared his throat, glancing between us. "It's authentic," I added. "You can call Holloway right now if you want." Mark didn't move, but his jaw shifted, just a fraction. That tiny tell was enough. He handed the paper to the nearest guard who studied the signature at the bottom. "I've seen this before," the guard said. "It's legit." Mark turned on him. "You're seriously—" "Sir," the guard interrupted, careful but firm. "If this clause is valid, we can't legally stop her." For a long second Mark's gaze burned into me. I met it without flinching. Finally, with a sharp exhale, he stepped back. The guard unlocked the gate, the chain clinking as it fell away. The movers arrived minutes later, 2 large trucks and a small crew, all in plain Navy uniforms. They rolled in without hesitation, their breath puffing in the cold air as they began hauling padded crates toward the front steps. Mark stood to the side, his arms crossed, watching as the first painting was carefully wrapped and carried toward the truck. The bronze sculpture followed, then a gleaming cherry-red convertible from the garage. I walked past him without slowing, my clipboard in hand. "Every item is documented with witnesses," I said, my voice calm. "You're welcome to keep a copy." His mouth opened, but no words came. He simply stood there, rooted, as the house around him began to empty. From the upstairs window, Elaine and Thomas appeared, checking off items as they were packed. Downstairs, the appraiser's list in my bag felt like a weight of pure gold. By the time the last crate was secured, the sound of tape being torn and straps tightening filled the air. Mark looked smaller now, the set of his shoulders no longer broad with victory. I gave him one last glance before stepping into the lead truck. "Enjoy the house, Mark," I said. "I'll enjoy the memories." The engine roared to life, the trucks pulling away in a slow, steady line. Behind us, the once proud estate stood still, its gates swinging slightly in the wind. The balance had shifted, and we both knew it. The moment my boots hit the marble of the foyer, the air in the estate felt different, charged, like the seconds before a summer storm breaks. Movers streamed in behind me, their heavy work gloves squeaking faintly against the polished wood banisters as they carried crates and padded blankets. "Start with the study," I told Elaine and Thomas. They nodded and split off, one heading for the library, the other toward the back gallery where the art was displayed. Mark trailed close, his footsteps sharp against the floor. "You're not taking that," he barked as Thomas passed with a rolled canvas under one arm. "Actually," I said, not bothering to look at him, "I am. It's sentimental." covered under the claws. His scoff echoed through the high ceilings, but he didn't try to grab it. The movers had the precision of people used to working under pressure. Every piece swaddled in layers of quilted wrap, strapped into wheeled dollies, and out the door in minutes. In the dining room, Elaine lifted the glass case over a set of silver serving pieces. "Your grandmother's," she murmured, knowing Mark was still within earshot. "Richard's grandmother's," I corrected. "We use them every Thanksgiving." Mark made a sound between a laugh and a growl, but when I handed him the duplicate paperwork Holloway had prepared, his hand froze over the page. Every item signed, documented, witnessed. He had no way to stop it. We moved in a steady rhythm, art from the gallery, heirloom furniture from the parlor, the mahogany writing desk Richard had found at an estate sale before we were married. Each piece that passed through my hands wasn't just valuable, it was a memory reclaimed. The study was last. I pushed the heavy door open, the familiar scent of cedar and old paper wrapping around me. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, landing on the leather chair where Richard used to sit for hours, reading or jotting notes in his slanted handwriting. On the desk, next to a stack of neatly bound journals, lay the vintage watch he wore nearly every day. The leather band was worn soft, the brass face dulled at the edges. I picked it up, the weight familiar in my palm. Without a word, I slipped it into my pocket. That one wasn't going into any crate. It was mine. Mark appeared in the doorway, leaning one shoulder against the frame, arms crossed. "You're really stripping this place bare," he said, voice tight. "I'm taking what's mine," I replied. His gaze flicked to Cooper, who had settled himself across the threshold like a sentry, chin on his paws but eyes tracking Mark's every movement. For a long beat, none of us moved. Then Mark pushed off the frame and stepped aside, letting me pass. By late afternoon, the echo of tape ripping and dollies rolling over tile filled the house. The sun had dropped low enough to cast long golden shadows down the hallway. I did one last walk through, the empty hooks where paintings had hung looking almost accusatory. Outside, the movers secured the final straps on the truck doors. The engines rumbled to life, a low vibration underfoot. Mark stood in the middle of the foyer, arms at his sides now, his expression unreadable. The space around him felt cavernous without the weight of the objects that had once filled it. I paused with my hand on the front door. "You said I was getting the dog, Mark," I said, meeting his eyes. "You forgot who trained him to guard what matters." Cooper trotted out beside me, tail wagging, as the trucks rolled down the drive. I didn't look back, but I could feel the silence behind me, a house hollowed out, and a man realizing too late that the balance had shifted for good. The driveway unfurled behind me in the rearview mirror, the tall pines closing in around the shrinking silhouette of the Bennett estate. Sunlight caught on the iron gates one last time before they disappeared entirely. My hands relaxed on the wheel, though the thrum of adrenaline still lingered in my veins. Beside me, Cooper sat upright in the passenger seat, his head turned toward the window as if keeping watch. The rumble of the moving trucks ahead of us was steady, like a convoy escorting something precious, and in a way, it was. Snow had started to fall, soft at first, dusting the windshield. By the time we reached the highway, it thickened into fat, slow flakes drifting lazily through the air. The world outside blurred into a quiet monochrome. An hour later, the glowing neon open sign of a roadside diner broke the white landscape. I pulled in, the bell above the door chiming as we stepped inside. The air was warm, thick with the smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee. A waitress with a pen tucked behind her ear smiled. "Two?" she asked, eyeing Cooper. "Just me," I said, returning the smile. "But he's family." She led us to a booth by the window. Cooper curled at my feet, and I ordered coffee and a slice of cherry pie without even looking at the menu. When it arrived, the steam from the mug curled into the air, the bitter scent mingling with the sweet tang of the pie filling. I took the first bite slowly, letting the sugar cut through the lingering taste of the day. Dry air, cardboard boxes, the metallic edge of confrontation. For the first time in weeks, my shoulders eased. The phone buzzed against the table. David's name lit the screen. "I hear the trucks are on their way," he said when I answered, voice carrying the faint hum of background chatter wherever he was. "They are," I said, smiling despite myself, "and I couldn't have done it without you. You did the hard part, but Claire," His tone shifted, lower now. Mark's not going to just swallow this. I'd bet my last dollar he'll try to hit back legally. I took a sip of coffee, the heat grounding me. Let him. I have every document signed, every witness lined up. He can drag me into court if he wants. But this time, I'm not coming in empty-handed. There was a pause, then a small chuckle. You sound more like Richard than you realize. When we hung up, I sat for a moment, watching snow collect on the hood of my car outside. If Mark wanted a fight, I was ready for it. The trucks had already been instructed to make their first stop at a secure storage facility 2 towns over. By the time I arrived, the crew was unloading with the same careful efficiency they'd shown at the estate. The space I'd rented was climate-controlled, a vault for the things that mattered most, both in value and in meaning. One by one, the crates disappeared into the room, the metal door sealing behind them with a heavy finality. I kept the key in my pocket, feeling its weight like a promise. On the drive back, night settled in, the snow thickening again under the glow of the street lamps. Cooper's head rested on my thigh, his steady breathing filling the quiet between us. It struck me then how close I'd come to losing all of it, not just the art and jewelry, but the tangible pieces of the life Richard and I had built, pieces that told our story in colors, textures, and worn edges. A week ago, Mark's words had almost become truth. You're getting the dog. That's it. Now, as the snow softened the world outside, I knew better. I wasn't just walking away with Cooper. I was walking away with everything that mattered. The email from my attorney landed in my inbox just after sunrise. Mark Bennett has filed an emergency motion to freeze all assets removed from the Bennett estate. For a moment, the words seemed to hover on the screen, refusing to sink in. Then the weight of them settled in my chest, not as fear, but as confirmation. I'd been expecting this. By mid-morning, I was sitting in the polished glass conference room of Adler and Pierce, the city's most expensive law firm, a folder of documents at my side. Outside the window, snow was melting in rivulets down the pane, the city waking under a pale winter light. My attorney, Linda Pierce, entered with a file in hand and a look that said she'd already read every word of the motion. She was tall, her hair pulled into a sharp twist, and she moved with the calm precision of someone who'd seen every kind of fight. They want a freeze order until ownership is clarified, she said, sliding into the chair across from me. Court date is set for next Tuesday. That gives us 6 days. Placed the manila folder on the table and pushed it toward her. Every piece of documentation Holloway gave me, including the signed hidden clause, witness statements from Elaine and Thomas, and I hesitated, then added, 3 letters from Richard that I found after the move. He makes it clear he wanted me to have the items. Linda's eyes flicked up. Originals? Yes. She opened the folder and began scanning, her pen tapping lightly against the table. The faint scent of her coffee mingled with the smell of paper and ink. Cooper shifted at my feet, his chin resting on my shoe, warm and steady. These letters are gold, she said finally. They corroborate intent, which is what the judge will be looking for. But, she set the papers down, leaning forward. I'm obligated to tell you there's a faster path. Settlement. You'd keep most of what you've taken, return a few pieces, and the whole thing disappears quietly. No, I said, without hesitation. Claire, I'm not doing this quietly. I cut in. If we settle, Mark walks away thinking he can push me around again. I want the judge to say it, on record, in front of him, that I was right. For a beat, Linda studied me, her pen now still in her hand. Then she nodded. All right, we'll go to court. The next days were a blur of preparation. I spent hours at Linda's office, the conference table covered in neat stacks, appraisal certificates, signed witness statements, legal references to the clause Richard had crafted. Each document was like a piece of armor, and with every one we reviewed, I felt the weight of doubt lifting. Mark could bluster all he wanted, but facts were on my side. On the 3rd day, I sat across from Linda while she fine-tuned our opening statement. The hum of the heater filled the quiet moments between her edit. Cooper dozed under the table, occasionally thumping his tail against my ankle, as if reminding me he was still there. You're ready for this, Linda said, not looking up from her notes. I know, I said, and meant it. By Friday night, my home office was a fortress of binders and labeled folders. The letters from Richard were tucked into a protective sleeve, the paper worn soft at the edges from years in the cedar chest. I ran my fingers over his handwriting, feeling the strength in each loop and line. Don't let anyone take what's yours. The next morning, I took Cooper for a long walk along the frozen shoreline, the wind sharp and briny against my face. The horizon was a pale silver, endless and steady. Mark wanted a war. Fine, I'd give him one. And this time, I'd make sure there was no doubt about who walked away the victor. The courthouse smelled faintly of floor polish and paper. Sterile, cold. My heels clicked against the marble as Linda and I walked toward the double doors of courtroom 3. Cooper couldn't come inside, but I'd left him in the care of a friend who promised to keep him warm until this was over. Inside, the benches were half filled with curious faces. Mark was already at the plaintiff's table, leaning in close to his attorney, a sharp-featured man in an expensive navy suit. When Mark caught sight of me, a smirk tugged at his mouth. It was the same one he'd worn at the will reading, but today, it didn't land the way it had then. The bailiff called the court to order, and the judge, a tall, silver-haired woman with a voice like stone on water, took her seat. Mark's lawyer rose first. Your Honor, the defense rests its case entirely on a so-called hidden clause in the decedent's will. This document, however, was never notarized. Without notarization, it cannot be considered legally binding under estate law. He spoke with the confidence of a man who believed the game was already won. Linda stood slowly, her notes in one hand. Your Honor, she began, her tone even but carrying a quiet charge. The clause in question was more than notarized. It was recorded. Mark's head snapped toward her. Linda gestured toward the clerk, who wheeled a small screen to the front. She pressed play, and the grainy image of Richard filled the room. He sat at his desk, wearing the navy sweater I'd bought him 2 winters ago. His voice was steady as he read the clause aloud, word for word, the sound crackling slightly in the recording. At the end, he looked into the camera. This is my will, amended for the respect my wife deserves. Notarized today, March 14th, at 3:17 p.m. The timestamp glowed in the corner of the frame, the notary's stamp visible on the paper he held up. The silence in the courtroom was thick enough to feel. Even the faint hum of the ceiling lights seemed to fade. Linda let the video play to the end, then stopped it with a single tap. Your Honor, this is the original media file, provided by Mr. Holloway, the family's attorney, and certified as authentic. It is irrefutable proof of both Richard Bennett's intent and the legality of the clause. The judge leaned back in her chair, her gaze settling on Mark's attorney. Do you wish to respond? The man opened his mouth, closed it, then shook his head. In that case, the judge said, her voice cutting clean through the room, this court upholds the validity of the clause. Furthermore, given the baseless nature of the plaintiff's claim and the unnecessary legal costs incurred, I am awarding the defendant's legal fees to be paid out of the plaintiff's share of the inheritance. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. I glanced at Mark. His face was pale, his jaw tight. The smirk was gone, replaced with something smaller. Shock, maybe, or the realization that the board had just been cleared of all his pieces. The gavel came down once, sharp and final. Linda gathered our papers, her mouth curving in the faintest smile. That, she whispered, is what we call a clean win. I rose, smoothing the front of my coat. My steps toward the door felt lighter than they had in months, not because of the paintings or jewelry or even the cars, but because the weight of proving myself had finally lifted. Outside, the air was crisp, and snow had begun to fall in slow, deliberate flakes. They caught in my hair and melted against my cheeks. I paused on the courthouse steps, letting the cold seep in. Richard had trusted me to stand my ground. Today, I had. And no court order, no smug remark, no locked gate could take that away. I walked down the steps, the city's noise muffled under the falling snow, free in a way I hadn't been since before the will was read. The first thing I sold was the mahogany dining set from the estate. A beautiful piece, but far too large for the home I knew I wanted. The auction house handled it discreetly, along with several smaller antiques whose value far outweighed their sentimental pull. Others I kept without question. The bronze sculpture Richard had placed in his study window, the vintage watch that still fit my wrist perfectly, the oil painting we'd chosen together during our trip to Santa Fe. Some things were worth more to my heart than they could ever fetch at auction. By spring, the proceeds had made something possible I hadn't dared imagine during the long months after Richard's death. I bought a smaller house by the coast, pale blue with white shutters, just a few blocks from the water. When I opened the windows, I could hear the waves rolling in, steady and patient. Cooper took to it immediately. Each morning we walked down to the beach, the salt air clinging to my hair, the sand cool beneath my shoes. He would race along the shoreline, his paws kicking up sprays of water, returning to me with his tongue lolling and his eyes bright. The garage became my studio. I cleared out the moving boxes, set up an easel, and unpacked paints that had sat untouched for years. Richard had always encouraged me to paint, but between the business dinners, travel, and household demands, I'd rarely found the time. Now I painted for hours, sometimes until the light outside shifted to gold. My first pieces were tentative, the brushstrokes stiff, but as the days passed, the lines loosened, colors bleeding together in ways that surprised me. It wasn't long before I found my way into the local art community. The town's gallery hosted open evenings once a month, and I began attending, a glass of wine in one hand, my other gesturing as I spoke with fellow artists. They were a mix of retirees, young dreamers, and people, like me, starting over in the middle of life, not quite by choice, but determined to make it theirs. One night, as I stood before a friend's new landscape piece, I overheard someone mention Mark. Apparently, he'd sold his share of the business at a loss, some ill-advised investments draining what remained. The news slid over me without catching. I felt no sharp twist, no lingering sting, just nothing. Peace had taken its place. I hosted my first dinner in the new house that summer. Elaine and Thomas came, along with two of the artists I'd grown close to. The table was small but full. Platters of roasted vegetables, fresh bread, bottles of wine we uncorked without ceremony. The scent of garlic and rosemary filled the air, mingling with the sound of laughter. No one there cared about the value of what hung on my walls or sat in my cabinet. They cared about the warmth of the room, the stories we traded over dessert, the way Cooper curled under the table and sighed contentedly. As the evening wound down, I stepped onto the back porch, the ocean's low roar folding into the quiet hum of conversation inside. The sky was streaked with the last traces of sunset, and the breeze carried the briny smell of the tide. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost, or even what I'd won. I was simply here, in a life I'd chosen, built piece by piece from what had nearly been taken from me. When I went back inside, my friends raised their glasses. I raised mine in return, smiling. Not because I'd beaten Mark, not because I'd kept the things Richard left me, but because, at last, I'd found the space to simply live. It still amazes me how clearly I remember the sound of that first sentence at the will reading, the primary resident, to Mark Bennett, the slow, deliberate way Holloway read it, as if each word had been dipped in ice water. For weeks afterward, I thought of that day as the moment everything was taken from me. But sitting here now, in the living room of my little blue house by the coast, I see it differently. That was the day the door opened. I just didn't know it yet. The fire crackles in the hearth, the scent of salt air mixing with burning oak. Cooper is stretched out on the rug, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. He doesn't stir when I shift in my chair, but one ear twitches toward me. I think of Richard, not the man in the hospital bed, frail and avoiding the will conversation, but the man who left me those quiet breadcrumbs, the property deed tucked among his papers, the note in his handwriting, and that sealed clause, crafted with just enough foresight to ensure I had the tools to stand my ground. He hadn't given me step-by-step instruction. He'd given me something better, the chance to prove to myself I could win without them, and I had. There's no anger left for Mark now, no itch to settle the score further. He has his life, I have mine, and our paths don't need to cross again. My satisfaction doesn't come from knowing what he lost. It comes from knowing I didn't let him define me. On the shelf above the desk sits a small fireproof lockbox. Inside, beneath the appraisal papers and legal forms, lies a USB drive, the video of Richard reading the clause aloud. I take it out sometimes, not to remember the fight, but but to hear his voice, warm and steady, the way it sounded in the best years of our marriage. Tonight, I tuck it back into its place, locking the box with a quiet click. It's not the most valuable thing I own, but it's the one I'd save if the house were burning. A knock sounds at the front door, pulling me from the thought. Cooper lifts his head, tail thumping once against the rug before he pads over to greet whoever's there. Through the window, I see Elaine and Thomas, bundled against the wind, their arms full of bread and wine. Behind them, the soft glow of the street lamp paints the falling snow in shades of gold. I open the door, and warmth rushes out to meet the cold. "Come in," I say, stepping aside as they stamp snow from their boots. The kitchen fills quickly with the sound of glasses clinking, the smell of rosemary and garlic from the roast I've had in the oven since afternoon. Laughter spills into the living room as more friends arrive, coats draped over chairs, voices overlapping in easy conversation. Cooper moves from guest to guest, collecting scratches and murmured greetings, finally settling by the fire again when everyone has found a seat. I glance around the room, at the people who know me not as the widow who fought her stepson, but simply as Claire. At the art on the walls, chosen for beauty, not value. At the small, worn watch on my wrist, ticking softly beneath the hum of voices. And I feel it. Solid, unshakable gratitude. Not just for what I've kept, but for what I've built since. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I can almost hear Richard again. "You'll know what to do." The conversation swells and I join in, my voice folding into the warm, bright noise. Outside, snow gathers on the windowsills, the ocean whispering just beyond the dunes. From here, the will reading feels like a lifetime ago, and in a way, it is, because that day didn't end my story. It gave me more than he ever imagined.